The table that never came, it was supposed to be a simple evening. After a long day of quiet meetings and planning sessions, Mark Zuckerberg had decided to slip away from the noise and formality for a few hours. No cameras, no speeches, no security. Detail announcing his every step. Just a quiet dinner alone at a small, well-reviewed restaurant he had heard about from a driver earlier that week. It was tucked away in a quieter part of the city, the kind of place where life moved at a slower, softer rhythm, where conversations floated warmly across tables lit by the soft glow of hanging lights. Mark arrived wearing simple clothes, jeans, a dark jacket, worn sneakers. He kept his head low, letting the crowd flow around him unnoticed. It felt good for once to be just another face in a world too busy to look too closely. He pushed open the door of the restaurant, a small bell chiming above him, and stepped into the cozy, golden warmth. The hostess at the front desk looked up, her smile polite but fading slightly as she took in his appearance. Her eyes flickered down to his shoes, his jacket, the way his hair was slightly tousled from the wind. She gave a tight smile and said, "Do you have a reservation?" Mark shook his head. "No, just one, if that's okay." The hostess hesitated. She glanced toward the dining room, where several tables sat empty, soft laughter rising from a few occupied booths. She looked back at him, her smile tighter now. Practiced. "I'm sorry," she said, not quite meeting his eyes. "We're fully booked." "Tonight?" Mark blinked, surprised. He had seen the empty tables himself. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer to wait, but something in her stiff posture stopped him. "Maybe try somewhere else down the street," she said quickly, already reaching for the phone to avoid further conversation. Mark stepped back slowly, feeling the curious prickle of eyes on his back from other diners who had paused to watch the small scene unfold. He gave a small nod, murmured a quiet thank you, and pushed the door open again, stepping back out into the cold night. He stood for a moment on the sidewalk, letting the chill seep into his skin, the sounds of the restaurant fading behind him. It was not anger he felt, not really. It was something more complicated, something he had not felt in a long time: invisibility. For a man used to boardrooms full of eager smiles and carefully prepared welcome speeches, it was a strange, humbling thing to be turned away with a glance, a judgment made in seconds based on nothing but appearance. He thought about how easily it had happened, how easily it must happen to people every day, people without his name, his power, his safety nets. He pulled his jacket tighter around him and began to walk, not really sure where he was going. The city was alive around him, bright windows spilling golden light onto wet sidewalks, taxis honking impatiently at corners, music drifting from open doors. But inside Mark's mind, there was only silence and the slow, heavy turning of thoughts. After a few blocks, he found a small food cart tucked into the corner of a parking lot. The vendor, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and hands scarred from years of hard work, greeted him warmly without a second glance at his worn clothes. Mark ordered a simple meal, a hot dog wrapped in foil and a steaming cup of black coffee, and sat on the curb to eat, the heat of the food warming his fingers. As he sat there, watching the city breathe around him, a thought began to form slowly, stubbornly, deep in his chest. Maybe the point of tonight was not to find a perfect dinner or a comfortable table. Maybe the point was to remember that dignity is not something you earn with wealth or fame. It is something you deserve simply by existing. And maybe, just maybe, he had forgotten that. Mark finished his meal slowly, savoring the simplicity of it. He thanked the vendor sincerely, slipping a generous tip into the small jar without a word, and stood again, feeling a strange, quiet energy stirring inside him. He could have gone back to his hotel then, back to warmth and comfort and familiar walls. He could have written the night off as an unfortunate, humbling moment and moved on, but something inside him, something old and restless, refused to let him walk away. He pulled out his phone and began scrolling, looking not for reviews or luxury, but for places forgotten by glossy websites and curated guides, places that did not turn people away because of how they looked, places built not for status, but for belonging. He found a small listing buried deep in a community board, a late-night soup kitchen on the other side of the city, open to anyone who needed a meal, no questions asked. Mark slipped his phone back into his pocket and started walking. He did not know then that the choice he had just made to turn toward humility instead of resentment would lead him into a night that would change more lives than his own. He did not know that sometimes the doors that close on you are just trying to guide you to the ones you were always meant to open, and he certainly did not know that before the night was over, the world would see a side of him that no headline had ever captured. Where kindness has no price. The streets changed as Mark walked farther away from the polished heart of the city, the bright glass towers giving way to crumbling brick walls and alleys bathed in the flickering light of old street lamps. The crowds thinned. The polished shoes and designer coats disappeared, replaced by worn jackets and careful, tired eyes. The rain that had threatened earlier finally arrived, a soft mist falling like a sigh from the dark sky. Mark pulled his jacket tighter and kept moving, the address of the small soup kitchen glowing faintly on the screen of his phone. He turned a corner and saw it, a modest building with peeling paint, a crooked sign above the door that simply read, "Welcome." The word was faded, but still fighting to be seen, much like the people who now gathered near the entrance. Men and women huddled under the narrow awning, sharing cigarettes, swapping quiet stories, laughing in low voices that carried the weight of survival. There was no red carpet here, no reserved tables or velvet ropes, just a door that stayed open no matter who you were or where you had been. Mark hesitated for a moment, standing across the street, feeling a strange tightness in his chest. He had walked into boardrooms with billion-dollar deals hanging on his words and never once felt fear like he felt now. But he also felt something else, something he had not felt in a long time, the raw, electric thrill of stepping into a place where he was just another soul among many, no richer, no poorer, no more important than the person beside him. He took a breath and crossed the street. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of warm bread, canned soup, and the indefinable smell of 100 human lives brushing against each other. Folding tables filled the small room, covered with mismatched plastic cloths. Volunteers bustled back and forth behind a long counter, ladling soup into chipped bowls and stacking loaves of donated bread. Laughter echoed from a far corner where someone had set up an old radio playing soft jazz. No one looked twice at Mark as he entered. No one cared about the dirt on his shoes or the wear on his jacket. He was greeted only by a volunteer, a woman in her 60s with silver hair tied in a bun and eyes sharp with kindness, who handed him a tray with a bowl of soup, a piece of bread, and a warm smile. "Eat first," she said, her voice brisk but gentle. "Talk later." Mark found a seat near the window, next to an older man who was carefully organizing a deck of worn playing cards. The man nodded in greeting but said nothing, focused on his task. Mark sat quietly, sipping the hot broth, feeling it spread warmth through his cold limbs. He let the noise and life of the room wash over him, each voice and movement a thread in a tapestry woven from hardship, resilience, and stubborn hope. After a while, the man beside him spoke without looking up. "First time?" Mark smiled faintly. "Yeah." The man nodded as if this explained everything. "Don't worry," he said. "We're all just passing through." They fell into easy conversation, and Mark learned his name was Charlie. Once a carpenter, now just another man carrying too many regrets and too few chances. But there was no bitterness in Charlie's voice, only a steady acceptance that life sometimes breaks you in ways you do not see coming. He spoke about the kindnesses that had saved him. A hot meal, a dry blanket, a hand offered without judgment. Small things that had kept him going even when everything else had crumbled. Mark listened, humbled and deeply moved. He realized that the real wealth of the world was not sitting in private vaults or glittering behind glass displays. It was here, in the stubborn generosity of people who had nothing to spare but shared anyway. It was in the way someone would slide half a piece of bread to a stranger without thinking twice. It was in the way laughter survived, even in places most had forgotten. As the evening wore on, Mark noticed a small commotion near the entrance. A young boy, no more than 10, stood in the doorway, dripping wet and shivering. He clutched a torn backpack to his chest, his eyes wide and terrified. The volunteers rushed to him, wrapping him in an old blanket, leading him to a seat by the heater. Mark watched, feeling something break open inside him. He stood, crossing the room slowly, and crouched down beside the boy. "What's your name?" he asked gently. The boy hesitated, glancing around nervously. "James," he whispered. Mark smiled. "Hi, James. I'm Mark. You're safe here." The boy said nothing, but he inched closer to the warmth. A volunteer handed him a steaming cup of cocoa, and for the first time a small, fragile smile touched the boy's lips. Mark sat with him, telling him silly stories about the rain, about how sometimes it felt like the sky was crying because it missed the sun too much. James listened, his eyes wide, the tension slowly melting from his small shoulders. Around them, the room carried on, laughter, music, the clatter of dishes. But in that small circle of warmth, something sacred was happening. Mark realized then that the kindness he had found here was not something that could be bought or demanded. It was something given freely, without expectation, without calculation, and it was more powerful than any technology he had ever built. Later, as he helped stack chairs and wipe down tables, Mark thought about the restaurant that had turned him away, the polished floors and empty tables guarded by silent judgments. He thought about the table he had found instead, chipped and battered, but surrounded by humanity too fierce to be ignored. He thought about how easy it was to forget that the real heart of a community was not measured in stars or reviews, but in the spaces where no one was ever turned away. And as he left the small soup kitchen that night, the mist swirling around him, James asleep in a chair by the heater, and Charlie still organizing his deck of cards, Mark made a decision that would ripple far beyond this quiet corner of the city. He would not just leave a donation. He would not just post a photo or write a check. He would build something lasting, something that would remind the world that kindness, once planted, could grow roots stronger than any empire. But first, he would have to return to the restaurant that had turned him away, not with anger, but with an invitation to change. The table for everyone, the morning after the night at the soup kitchen. The city seemed sharper, clearer, as if the rain had washed away some invisible layer that had long covered it. Mark walked the streets with a different kind of awareness, no longer seeing just buildings and cars and advertisements, but faces, eyes, small movements that told stories deeper than words. Every person who rushed past him, every tired vendor, setting up their stand, every mother dragging a stroller over a cracked sidewalk carried a universe inside them, a lifetime of dreams and hardships and hopes that deserved to be seen. Mark had spent years building digital worlds where millions connected with a click, but now he realized how easy it was to lose sight of the real people those numbers represented. He returned to his hotel room not to rest, but to plan. He sat at the small desk by the window, a cheap pen scratching across the pages of a battered notebook. He thought about the restaurant that had turned him away, about the polished menus and the carefully curated image that had left no room for someone who looked like he did that night. He thought about the soup kitchen, about the volunteer who had handed him a meal without a second thought, about Charlie's quiet resilience, about little James shivering in the doorway but finding safety without judgment. The contrast burned in his mind, and from that fire an idea was born. Mark would not retaliate. He would not shame the restaurant publicly or destroy their reputation with a single post that could reach millions. He knew that would be easy, but it would not fix anything. It would only feed the same cycle of division and anger that already blooded the world. Instead, he would build something better, something that would stand not as a monument to anger, but as a celebration of the kind of humanity he had rediscovered in the smallest, most forgotten corners of the city. He decided he would create a new kind of restaurant, but not just another place to eat. It would be a space where anyone, no matter how they looked, where they came from, or what they carried in their pockets, would be welcomed. No reservation needed, no judgments made. No one turned away because they did not fit an invisible mold. The food would be good, affordable, hearty. The tables would be long and communal, encouraging conversation between strangers. There would be private booths for those who needed space and quiet corners for those who wanted to read or simply sit. And one table, the largest one, placed right at the center, would always remain empty, kept open at all times, a symbol, and a promise that there would always be a place for someone who needed it most. Mark knew that to make this dream real, he would need more than just an idea. He would need people who believed. He would need workers willing to serve not just meals, but dignity. He would need suppliers willing to support the cause even when profits were not the top priority, and he would need to fund it quietly, without fanfare, without attaching his name, in lights above the door. It had to be about the mission, not the man. He made calls, he sent emails, he reached out to people he trusted, people who had hearts bigger than their resumes. At first, there was hesitation, confusion. Some thought he was joking. Others worried about the risks. But Mark spoke with a passion that cut through the doubts, a passion born not from speeches or strategy, but from a night spent on a wet curb, eating a hot dog wrapped in foil and realizing how far he had drifted. From the ground he once stood on, slowly the pieces began to fall into place. A small building, abandoned for months, was secured near the heart of the city. A local chef, known not for fame but for feeding the hungry after hours in his restaurant, agreed to run the kitchen. Suppliers signed on, intrigued by the idea of being part of something bigger than profit margins. Volunteers from the soup kitchen offered to help on opening day, some even asking if they could work there permanently. And through it all, Mark worked alongside them. Not as a distant founder or a silent investor, but as another pair of hands scrubbing floors, painting walls, hauling furniture. He wore the same worn jeans, the same heavy coat, blending in among the workers who had no idea that the man beside them had once been one of the most recognized faces on the planet. He called the restaurant the Open Table. There would be no gold plaques, no exclusive backrooms, no velvet ropes. Just good food, open arms, and the unwavering belief that everyone deserved a place to be seen, heard, and fed. As the weeks passed and the opening day drew closer, word of the project began to spread quietly through the city. People whispered about it in barbershops and corner stores, stories passing from mouth to mouth like small, precious secrets. Some came out of curiosity, others out of need, but all were drawn by the same quiet hope, that maybe, just maybe, there was still a place in the world built for everyone, not just for a chosen few. The night before the opening, Mark stood, alone in the middle of the restaurant, the lights dimmed low, the tables set with simple plates and fresh flowers donated by a local garden. He walked slowly through the space, running his fingers lightly along the polished wood of the center table, the one that would always stay empty. He thought about the little boy, James, about Charlie and the others whose names he had never learned, but whose faces he would never forget. He thought about the millions like them, invisible to a world too busy chasing glitter and noise, and he whispered a promise into the silent air. "This table is for you." He left that night with a heart fuller than it had been in years, ready for whatever would come next. He knew the real challenge was not just to open the doors, it was to keep them open, to keep believing in the power of kindness even when the world tried to close in again. And as the city slept, unaware of the small revolution about to unfold in its heart, Mark Zuckerberg walked the empty streets with a quiet, unstoppable hope burning inside him. The first meal, the sun rose slow and golden on the day the open table opened its doors, the light spilling across the city like a quiet promise. Mark stood inside the restaurant long before the first guest arrived, breathing in the soft scent of fresh bread and clean wood, the tiny flutter of nerves and hope stirring inside him. The long tables were set simply but beautifully, small wildflowers tucked into mason jars, clean plates stacked neatly, chairs pulled out slightly as if already waiting for stories to be shared. It was not grand or flashy, but it was real, built, with hands and heart, and that was exactly how it was meant to be. By late morning, a line had formed outside the door. Some wore suits and ties, others wore old jackets and worn sneakers. Some came with curiosity, some with hunger, some with nothing but a fragile hope that maybe this place was not too good to be true. Mark watched them through the window, his heart thudding in his chest, knowing that this moment was bigger than any speech he had ever given, any company he had ever built. He wiped his hands on his jeans, nodded to the staff, most of them volunteers who had chosen heart over paycheck, and unlocked the door. The first guest to walk in was an elderly woman with silver hair tucked under a knitted cap. She hesitated, on the threshold, blinking as if afraid the door might close again. Mark stepped forward, smiling warmly, and gestured her inside. "Welcome," he said simply, and with that, the open table was alive. The restaurant filled slowly at first, the quiet clatter of dishes and the soft murmur of conversation growing stronger with every passing minute. Families, workers on lunch breaks, people who had slept on benches the night before, all sat, side by side without division, without the invisible lines that so often separated lives. No one asked for credentials, no one questioned who belonged. If you walked through the door, you belonged. That was enough. Mark moved through the restaurant not as a celebrity, not as an owner watching over his domain, but as another server, carrying plates, refilling glasses, clearing tables with sleeves rolled up and hands worn raw from honest work. He listened to the conversations that bloomed around him, plans for job interviews, worries about rent, laughter over old memories, each one a reminder that real life happened not in headlines or boardrooms, but here, in the small, unguarded moments between bites of warm food. Hours passed in a blur of smiles and quiet tears, of laughter and hesitant hope. And just when Mark thought his heart could not hold any more, the door opened again, and someone he never expected to see walked in. It was the hostess from the restaurant that had turned him away. She wore the same crisp uniform, her hair pulled back, but her eyes were different now, softer somehow, less sure of the world she moved through. She hesitated in the doorway, clutching her purse tightly, scanning the room filled with faces she might once have ignored. For a moment, Mark froze. The easy choice would have been to look away, to let her feel the sting of rejection he had once carried out into the cold night. But Mark knew better now. He knew that vengeance built nothing worth keeping. Only kindness, even when it hurt, and could change hearts. He crossed the room, weaving between tables and laughter and the clatter of spoons against bowls, and he greeted her just as he had greeted everyone else. "Welcome," he said, meaning it. The hostess blinked, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. Finally, she simply nodded and stepped inside, finding an empty chair at a crowded table where a man with a weathered face and a woman with a sleeping child welcomed her with easy smiles. No one asked why she was there. No one cared about the mistake she had made. Because at the open table, everyone deserved a seat. Mark watched her for a moment longer, then turned back to his work, carrying plates and clearing cups, his heart so full it ached. The evening came, and still the restaurant stayed alive, the lights glowing warm against the gathering darkness outside. A group of teenagers began playing music from a small speaker, and soon someone pulled 2 tables together to make room for dancing. Volunteers brought out extra loaves of bread and steaming pots of stew, and laughter spilled out onto the sidewalk, drawing even more people in from the cold streets. Mark found himself standing again at the center table, the one left empty by design, a symbol of the space that must always be kept open for the next person in need. He ran his hand along the wood, feeling the pulse of everything they had built together in every smooth grain. He thought about how a single closed door had led him here, how rejection had become an invitation, how loneliness had become a gathering place for hope. And he knew this was only the beginning. The open table would not be the only one. There would be more. In other cities, other corners of the world, where kindness was needed like water in a desert. And all of it had started not with money or power, but with the simple, stubborn belief that no one should ever be turned away from a table just because they did not fit the picture someone else expected to see. As the night deepened and the music played, and the doors stayed open long after most restaurants would have closed, Mark Zuckerberg stood at the heart of it all, not as a billionaire or a founder or a name in lights, but as a man who had finally remembered what it meant to be human. And he smiled, knowing that sometimes the tables we are denied lead us to the tables we are meant to build. When kindness becomes a movement, the days after the opening of the open table passed in a steady, beautiful blur, each one unfolding with new faces, new stories, and new beginnings stitched together across the long wooden tables where strangers became friends and weary travelers found rest. Word of the restaurant spread not through billboards or headlines, but through whispers carried on the wind, passed from hand to hand, mouth to mouth, heart to heart. It was the kind of fame no amount of money could buy, the kind built quietly by gratitude and hope rather than flash and spectacle. People came not because they were curious about a new place to eat, but because they had heard of a space where dignity was served alongside every meal. A space where no one needed to explain why they had nothing in their pockets, where no one cared if your shoes were worn or if your coat was patched at the elbows. They came for the warmth that filled the air thicker than the scent of fresh bread and stew, for the simple, stubborn magic of being welcomed without question. Mark spent his days and nights at the restaurant, sleeves rolled up, moving through the tables like a current, greeting guests, carrying plates, scrubbing dishes when needed. He never once revealed his identity, and after a while the volunteers and guests stopped asking who he was. He was simply Mark, another soul working to keep the fire burning. And that was exactly how he wanted it. But as the days stretched into weeks, and the open table grew from a secret into a symbol, new eyes began to turn toward it. Not the kind, curious eyes of neighbors, but the sharp, calculating gaze of business owners, city officials, and those who felt threatened by the idea that something built on giving could succeed where so many profit-driven ventures had failed. The first warning came in the form of a letter slipped under the restaurant door late one night. It was polite, almost friendly, written in careful legal language that made the threat behind it feel all the more chilling. Concerns about permits, about zoning laws, about food safety inspections. Not accusations yet, but warnings. A quiet reminder that success often comes with a cost, and that changing the world always wakes those who have a stake in keeping things the same. Mark sat alone at one of the tables after everyone had left, the letter heavy in his hands, his heart heavier. Still, he had known this would not be easy. He had known from the moment he chose kindness over comfort that there would be resistance, but knowing it did not make the burden lighter. He thought about closing, about slipping away quietly before the dream he had built could be torn apart, piece by people with deeper pockets and louder voices. It would have been so easy, safer, cleaner. But then he thought about James, the little boy who had once shivered in the doorway of the soup kitchen and now spent afternoons laughing with new friends at the open table. He thought about Charlie, who had found steady work through the restaurant's partnerships and now helped train new volunteers with a pride that could not be measured by a paycheck. He thought about the hostess from the first restaurant, now a regular volunteer, her face lighter, her steps quicker, as if some heavy shame had finally fallen from her shoulders. And he realized that the open table was no longer just a place. It was a living, breathing promise, a promise that someone believed enough in second chances to fight for them. So Mark stood up, folded the letter carefully, and placed it in the back of a drawer where it could not touch the warmth and laughter that filled the restaurant's walls. He would not fight back with anger. He would not turn the open table into a battlefield. He would answer fear with persistence, suspicion with transparency, threats with even more stubborn hope. He called a meeting with the staff and volunteers the next morning, explaining the situation simply and honestly. There were no fiery speeches, no rallying cries, just the quiet, steady promise that they would not be driven away. They would find a way to comply with the laws without losing the heart of what they had built. They would invite inspectors in with open arms, fix what needed fixing, and protect the soul of the open table with the same stubborn love that had created it. And slowly, something incredible began to happen. When word of the threat spread to the community, people responded not with fear but with action. Local business owners offered to help with repairs. Lawyers volunteered their services for free, finding creative ways to navigate the maze of regulations. Carpenters, electricians, and cleaners showed up without being asked, rolling up their sleeves and saying simply, "Where do you need me?" Even former critics, people who had once muttered that the open table would never last, now stood shoulder to shoulder with those they once ignored, hammering nails, scrubbing floors, fighting. For a dream that had become as much theirs as Mark's. It was messy, it was exhausting, it was beautiful. And through it all, Mark moved among them, his hands blistered from work, his voice hoarse from planning, his heart fuller than he had ever known was possible. He realized that the true strength of the open table was not in its founder or its walls, but in the way it had awakened something sleeping inside people, the deep, stubborn belief that even in a world too often built on exclusion, there could still be places built purely on belonging. By the time the inspections came, the open table was stronger than ever, its foundations not just wood and nails, but thousands of quiet acts of defiance against a world that told people they were only worth what they could pay. And when the inspectors finally left, satisfied and even quietly impressed, Mark knew they had not just saved a restaurant, they had saved a dream that was just beginning to grow. Because as he looked around at the tired but smiling faces, at the hands still dirty from work but reaching for each other without hesitation, Mark realized the open table was no longer his to protect. It belonged to everyone now, and it was unstoppable. The legacy built with open hands the first real winter. Storm of the season swept through the city a few weeks later, heavy with thick snow that blanketed the streets in soft, white silence. Shops closed early, windows shuttered against the biting wind, and the sidewalks emptied as people hurried to warmth. But inside the open table, the lights burned bright against the storm, and the smell of fresh stew and baked bread wrapped around. The guests like a second coat, The laughter was louder tonight, the conversations quicker, a stubborn defiance in every shared smile that dared the storm to find them. Mark stood by the long windows, watching the snow pile against the glass, his breath fogging the surface in slow bursts. Behind him, the restaurant pulsed with life, every chair filled, every bowl steaming, every heart wide open. The open table had survived its early battles, but more than that, it had thrived. The idea had caught fire, not through marketing or celebrity, but through the raw, undeniable human need to belong. News stations had come, at first skeptical, then curious, then quietly awed. Articles had been written, praising the restaurant with no reservations, only respect, but Mark had refused interviews, refused to be the face of the story. He knew better now. It was not about him. It was about them, and they were magnificent. Charlie had taken a full-time job managing the kitchen, his hands steady as he taught new volunteers how to work with pride. Little James, once a shivering boy at the soup kitchen door, came in every day after school, his backpack slung over one thin shoulder, his smile quick and easy now. Even the woman who had once turned Mark away at that first restaurant stood behind the counter most evenings, serving food with a warmth that could melt the iciest heart. Every table carried stories of second chances, of first smiles, of heavy burdens made lighter simply by sitting together. But tonight was different. Tonight, as the snow deepened and the city slowed to a crawl, Mark felt something shift inside him. Not sadness, not fear, but a deep, quiet knowing. His work here, at least for now, was coming to an end. The open table no longer needed him to move it forward. It had grown beyond one man's dream into a living, breathing proof that a better way was not just possible, it was already happening. He turned from the window and moved through the crowd, taking it all in one last time, as only an outsider can when they know they are about to leave. He shook hands, shared quick hugs, cleared dishes from tables where thank-you notes were left tucked under empty bowls. He slipped a new coat onto the shoulders of a man sleeping by the heater, tucked an extra loaf of bread into a woman's bag as she bundled her children against the cold. He said goodbye without saying the word, letting it live quietly in every touch, every nod, every smile. Finally, he stood by the great central table, the one they had always kept empty in honor of the next person who needed a seat. The wood was worn smooth now by countless hands, each one leaving behind a tiny piece of themselves. Mark placed both palms flat on the table and closed his eyes, breathing in the weight and wonder of all they had built here. He whispered a silent thank you, not to anyone in particular, but to the stubborn spirit that had carried him through every cold night, every locked door, every trembling beginning. And then, without fanfare, without a single soul noticing, Mark slipped out into the storm. He walked the empty streets, snow crunching under his boots, the city a quiet canvas waiting for new stories to be written. He did not take a car. He did not call anyone to pick him up. He simply walked, a man stripped of titles, wealth, and expectation, carrying only the invisible, unstoppable fire of what had been created from kindness and perseverance. In time, the open table became more than just one restaurant. Others followed. In neighboring cities, in forgotten corners of the country, each one carrying the same simple promise: if you come hungry, you will be fed. If you come tired, you will be welcomed. If you come broken, you will find space to heal. No one put Mark Zuckerberg's name on the plaques or the banners. That was how he wanted it. He had already received the only reward that mattered, the quiet knowledge that he had planted a seed the world would keep watering long after he was gone from it. And somewhere, years later, in another city covered in another winter storm, a boy with a worn backpack might push open the door of a warm, glowing restaurant, find a seat at a table that had been waiting just for him, and understand, without anyone needing to say a word, that he mattered, that he belonged because someone somewhere had believed that no door should ever stay closed against a hungry heart, and that belief, once planted, had changed the world in ways too vast and beautiful to ever fully be measured. And maybe that was the point all along.